For 3 relentless days, a gentle spring rain had blanketed Columbus, Georgia. It was not a storm that came in thunder or flashes of lightning, simply a steady drizzle, the kind that seeps into everything and soaks dirt roads into huge expanses of sticky mud, and swelling the Chattahoochee River higher by the hour. And on the 3rd night, as rain whispered over the sleeping town, Rebecca Thompson did not come home. Rebecca's evening had been a routine one, or at least, it should have been. On April 14, 2005, she'd attended a volunteer coordination meeting at the Muskogee County Community Center, a blocky red brick structure off Winton Road, with a faint smell of floor cleaner and stale coffee. From 6:30, sorting boxes of donated children's coats, smiling quietly with her other volunteers about nothing in general. Rebecca was 42, the sort of woman whose placid demeanor had a way of grounding every room she occupied, for close to 2 decades. She'd been working as an administrative assistant for the regional electric utility. The type of person who knew birthdays, carried spares umbrellas for colleagues, and had a reassuring word for anyone having a bad day. Her light brown hair, however, had begun to show silver threads at the temples. She was dressed in pastel cardigans, flat shoes, and reading glasses perched on a delicate chain. Rebecca Thompson was, by everyone's account, not the type of woman to just vanish. The session ended at 8:45 p.m. She was recorded exiting by the front entrance of the community center at 8:52 through security cameras. She wore a pale yellow raincoat, a canvas tote bag on her shoulder, and moved in her usual slow walk towards the bike rack. The camera angle was subpar, a grainy image of the top of her head and the flash of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. But it did catch her unlocking her trusty OL forest green 10-speed bike, the one she'd had since the late 90s. She rolled it out towards the road, and then disappeared beyond the scope of the camera, lost in rain and darkness. That was the last anyone had ever seen her alive. At home, meanwhile, her husband Dennis Thompson slept waiting for her. He woke up at 1:15 a.m. Her side of the bed was not disturbed. Her reading lamp was turned off. Her slippers were sitting in line beside the door, as she had left them that morning. A sinking dread seeped in. Dennis attempted to call her phone. 6 rings, voicemail. He attempted the community center. No answer. He called her sister, Margaret, on the other side of town. Nothing. At 2 a.m. Dennis was driving the foggy streets, running the 3-mile route Rebecca always drove home in. It was a short ride, one she'd made hundreds of times, but tonight the streets were deserted. His headlights picked up puddles, porches, and empty sidewalks, but not a glimpse of his wife. Just rain, night, and the sound of his tires on wet road. At 6:03 a.m., Dennis filed the missing persons report at the Columbus Police Department. Detective Aaron Mitchell, to 15 years on the job, had been assigned the case. He dealt with his share of missing persons reports, most wrapped up in dates: a runaway kid, a husband who'd blown into town to calm down. But something about Rebecca's case wasn't quite like the usual situation. Mitchell couldn't yet pinpoint just why, but he felt this one would be a case he'd remember for some time. 3 days later, that feeling turned to certainty. A dog walker along Bull Creek, a small stream that flowed into the Chattahoochee, roughly 6.5 miles from where Rebecca disappeared, noticed something half in, half out of shallow water. Her bike, the green paint still visible beneath mud, her canvas bag draped over the handlebars, soggy and full of water. Inside, police found a wrecked notebook, a crumpled pack of sugar-free gum, and a sunflower keychain. But no Rebecca. Groups combed the forest for 2 full days. Volunteers, officers, cadaver dogs. They found nothing but mud, poison ivy, and the skeletal remains of a deer that had lain there 4 years. The forest would not give up its secrets. Detective Mitchell stood next to the creek that morning, staring at the bicycle and attempting to build a scenario that would work. Ball Creek was not on the route home, not by a long shot. To get there, Rebecca would have had to ride miles in the opposite direction, over bad country roads through sections of pine woods and by old, vacant barns. There was no way she would have done it, and certainly not alone, at night, in the rain. Still, the inquiry persisted. Interviews with the volunteers at the community center yielded nothing. Everyone recalled Rebecca cheerful, focused, though one woman remarked she'd seemed preoccupied that evening, checking her watch several times and forgetting coffee afterwards. But preoccupied wasn't suspicious. People got preoccupied. Life pulled at people in different directions, and suspicion always found a way home. Police detectives began looking at Dennis Thompson, because in missing persons cases, the spouse is always the first shadow to be questioned. Dennis was cooperative as well, perhaps too cooperative, responding to every question again and again. He let police search his home, his car, even his office locker, and a rented storage shed full of Christmas trinkets and old records. He underwent a polygraph test. The results were inconclusive, not damning, but neither did they clear him. Dennis was 45, softly spoken, with thinning hair and the same worn look as a man who'd lost too much sleep. And as Detective Mitchell watched him over the table, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this case, about Rebecca's unobtrusive, defensive life ending abruptly in the rain, just didn't add up. Even before Rebecca vanished, Dennis Thompson's existence was methodical. He worked long, quiet days at the furniture plant, showing up to work at 6 each morning and often staying far into the evening. His fellow workers described him as reliable, dependable. A man who kept to himself and read worn paperback westerns during lunch breaks. There was never a whiff of melodrama, no gossip about trouble. And that was the biggest problem for detectives, no motive. There wasn't a massive life insurance policy, just a little one on the job with Rebecca, barely enough to cover a funeral. Their money was tight, but predictable. No gambling loans, no hidden accounts, no under-the-table spending. Neighborhoods along 19th Avenue provided the same report. An unremarkable, quiet couple who waved hello, mowed their lawn, and never argued loudly enough to be heard from one room to another. The most memorable point of contention was a furious argument last summer over the color of house trim. Rebecca liked cream. Dennis liked white. Cream won out. But in a group of fewer than 200,000, even the slightest ripples spread fast. Gossip started circulating, the sort that isn't fact-based, but instinct. Some said Rebecca had not been in good health lately. She'd stopped going to her weekly book club. Her neat garden had become overgrown and shaggy. A Piggly Wiggly clerk reported she looked gaunt, drained, that she'd been buying more frozen meals and fewer fresh vegetables. Little things. Nothing concrete, but they began piling up like misfitted puzzle pieces in Detective Aaron Mitchell's folder. They didn't belong together, but neither could they be dismissed. By early May, the case had come to a halt. The bike yielded nothing more than Rebecca's own fingerprints, and the muck it had been discovered in. No one had seen her once she departed from the community center. Her phone records indicated no unusual calls or messages. Her computer held nothing but work files, saved recipes, and chatty emails with her sister and her mother regarding grocery specials and the weather. The searches along Ball Creek were abandoned after fruitless days. And slowly, what started as an urgent investigation dissolved into the ordinary. Leads dissipated. Follow-up calls became fewer. The silence about Rebecca's vanishing became its own kind of answer. The unofficial theory, the one no one was courageous enough to commit to paper, that everyone kept to themselves, was that Rebecca had left voluntarily. Maybe she'd grown tired of her life, decided to escape. The discovery of the bicycle, they argued, could have been staged. Maybe she'd parked it there herself before leaving to begin a new life in some other town. It wasn't proof. It was absence. No body, no witnesses, no crime scene. And in the uncomfortable silence of that not knowing, it was easier for folks to believe that she'd just wanted to be gone, rather than dealing with the possibility that something far more sinister had occurred during the rain-drenched Georgia evening. Others, however, did not accept that story. Margaret Wilson, Rebecca's younger sister, didn't. Margaret was the bold one, the one to raise the difficult questions and not mind being the loudest voice in the room. While Rebecca softened herself to blend into the world around her, Margaret had learned to hone her edges instead. She was 40 years old, divorced, a nurse working long night shifts at Midtown Medical Center. Her hands were always red from frequent washing, her dark hair kept short for practicality. When the police investigation began to cool, Margaret felt it like a physical ache, as if the world was already moving on without Rebecca. Detective Mitchell still took her calls, but his updates grew shorter, more polite than sincere. "We're pursuing all leads," he'd tell her. "The case is still a priority," but Margaret had heard that tone. She'd heard it hundreds of times in the hospital, the tone people use when they are managing expectations before delivering bad news. And so, as the case sort of quietly migrated towards cold status, Margaret took it into her own hands. If the police were done looking for her sister, then she would do it for them. She never called it an investigation, but that is exactly what it became. Margaret started retracing Rebecca's last weeks, attending the same places, talking to the same people, but asking different questions. She returned to the Muskogee County Community Center and spoke with the other volunteers. Instead of asking if Rebecca had appeared distant, she asked Rebecca what had actually been spoken about that night. It was then that she learned something the initial police report never indicated. Rebecca made multiple calls in the community center's office one evening, and went outside twice to take calls on her cell phone. No one knows who she spoke to. Margaret wasn't content to let it go. Leaning on a favor from a lawyer friend, she had Rebecca's phone records and spent hours hunched over them at her kitchen table, a half cup of coffee going cold beside her. Most of the calls were expected: her husband, her mother, co-workers. But then there were 3 numbers that were not. 3 phone calls the week she disappeared, to a local number Margaret did not recognize. When she dialed it back, 6 rings and nothing. No answering machine, no voicemail. When she had tracked it down, it was a pay phone purchased at a Phoenix City Walmart, just across the Alabama line. The police had noticed, but never followed up. Prepaid phones were the norm, they'd said, disposable, for all kinds of harmless things, but Margaret did not believe that. By fall of 2005, her obsession had taken shape, literally. In her guest room, she built what she called the wall. A huge corkboard covered in photographs of Rebecca, maps of Columbus with colored pushpins, photocopied police reports, and every receipt or calendar page she could salvage from her sister's belongings. Red pins for the community center, blue where the bike was found, green for Rebecca's residence, yellow for every confirmed sighting in her most recent week. On the weekends, she organized her own search parties, co-workers, church members, and friends. They combed the same Ball Creek woods that had already been considered cleared. They bustled through thick cover, shouted her name into the wet, dense air, and heard the forest devour their cries. They found everything but Rebecca: trash, empty shotgun shells, old washing machine rusty and discarded in a ravine. But nothing of the woman they were all searching for. Dennis went to the early searches. Then he didn't appear anymore. The volunteers had noticed. They grumbled about it driving home. Margaret didn't hold it against him. Not really. But deep within her, she knew. The truth of what happened to her sister was still out there, waiting. Buried under the rain and the mud. Margaret could not help but condemn Dennis for the way he managed it. But down deep, neither did she. How was he to go back to work, to routine, to sitting in this house full of Rebecca's belongings, as if absence was something that you simply learned to live with? Late one evening, when Margaret stopped by and caught him sitting up in the darkness of the living room, Dennis had tried to explain. He said he saw Rebecca everywhere in the house, but nowhere. That her absence weighed, but somehow weighed nothing. That he did not know how to mourn someone who might have or might not have gone. It broke Margaret's heart, but also fueled a fire inside her. If that was all she had left, she would make mourning become action. She had printed out pamphlets with Rebecca's photo, a Christmas photo from the last one they'd shared. Rebecca smiling in front of the Christmas tree, in that red sweater that still hung in her closet, now smelling only faintly of cedar and sadness. Margaret passed out the pamphlets wherever she went: gas stations, supermarkets, laundromats, library notice boards. They grew dim with time, lost amidst the dross of everyday life, yard sale notices, lost pet posters, neighborhood happenings. Life went on to advance, even as Rebecca's had not. Margaret kept calling local reporters incessantly, trying to keep her sister's story in the headlines. She managed to secure 3 follow-ups in the next 18 months. Each shorter and shorter. Each farther and farther down the news page, or tacked onto the end of a late-night talk show. Missing woman still missing. Family still searching. No new leads. The coverage was ritual other than reporting, a perfunctory acknowledgement of a tragedy already silently consigned to the shelf. And for 6.5 years, that is where Rebecca Thompson's story lay. Until November of 2011, Eugene Carson, a male, was preparing to leave Columbus for good that month. His knees ached at 71 due to decades of hard labor, and the house, in which he had lived for 43 years, was too much for him to manage. He was moving to Knoxville, Tennessee, to join his daughter and grandchildren. Eugene was a maintenance supervisor at the Civic Center, a man who had the city's beat in his head. That morning, loading cartons into a U-Haul outside his Cherokee Avenue residence, his younger neighbor Carl Harris came out to lend a hand. Carl was around his 30s, worked nights at the shipping warehouse by the airport, friendly, talkative, the sort of neighbor you greet, but never really get to know. They talked on the job, shared small talk, weather, traffic, how much colder Knoxville would be. And then, almost as an afterthought, Cole said something that didn't matter at all, or at least not yet. He told me he'd been homeless since 2005, and that he remembered the last one who'd had a change of heart at a moment's notice, in the middle of the night. He told me he'd just come home from his job, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, when he saw a man a few blocks away, by where Cherokee Avenue dead-ended against Bull Creek. The guy was hauling something bulkily into a small fishing boat that was being trailed behind a pickup truck. Carl had thought it was odd, who gets into a boat in the dead of night? But he'd dismissed it. Maybe the dude was just heading out early morning fishing, trying to beat the sun rising. Eugene asked to see what the guy was like. Carl had not much to say. Just a figure under a half-burned street lamp. White male, medium build, dark windbreaker, maybe a sweatshirt. The truck was light-colored, tan or beige, old model. The boat was small, aluminum, the sort of thing you might find second-hand for a few $100s. And then Carl said something else, something that would have meant everything, if anyone had heard. He'd thought about it that night sometimes, especially when he'd learned about the missing woman, the one who'd had a bicycle found in Bull Creek. He'd wondered if the two might have something to do with each other. But he'd never gone to the cops with it. What were they going to do? I saw some guy with a boat at 3 a.m. 6 years ago. It was stupid. Eugene had nodded. Yeah, he'd said. Probably nothing. And that was all. They emptied the truck, shook hands, and went back to their lives. Carl worked that night, and forgot all about it. Eugene got into his car and headed to Knoxville the next morning, and didn't. 3 days later, while sorting boxes in his daughter's guest bedroom, the subject came back to Eugene's mind. The boat, the hour, the vicinity near Bull Creek. He thought of Rebecca Thompson, the woman who had vanished into the rain all those years ago. He thought of calling the Columbus Police Department. But then he talked himself out of it. What was he going to say? His neighbor had seen something years before that might be nothing. He couldn't even recall Carl's last name anymore. And for crying out loud, he was retired, in another state. It wasn't any concern of his. So the memory went into a mental drawer with a label that said interesting, but irrelevant, and there it stayed. Years passed. Eugene adapted to Knoxville, to the gentle rhythm of old age, babysitting the grandchildren, playing cards at the senior center, evening walks at a leisurely pace. The talk with Carl faded into the background until it existed only as a blur on the fringes of memory. But if he'd called, if he'd said anything at all, then maybe things would have been different. Because what Kyle and didn't know was that their small, insignificant conversation had potential to be the turning point. The kind of detail detectives dream and pray for. A shadow, a figure, a man in a boat, 3 o'clock in the morning, near Bull Creek, the same evening Rebecca Thompson went missing. But the tip never reached the police. It lived only in the receding memory of 2 men who had nothing to attach their recollection to, a forgotten case buried beneath years of rain, paper, and silence. Until 2018. By that point, the Columbus Police Department had changed. The musty old file cabinets were a thing of the past, replaced by glistening servers and digital archives. All of the cold cases had been photographed and input into a new system, a database that would seek patterns that human eyes could not. The program was called CaseLink, funded by a federal grant and initially created to identify financial fraud. Now, it was being used for something decidedly more human and decidedly more unsettling. Detective Iris Campbell, with the department for 3 years after serving with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, was among the first to apply it to cold cases. And the very first case she populated, the one that would lead her down a surprising path, was the disappearance of Rebecca Thompson. Detective Iris Campbell wasn't a gut-type detective. She was 34, and she had a reputation for being accurate, a very detail-oriented thinker who believed in facts, not instinct. Her partners joked that she worked more like a machine than a detective. But that was exactly why she succeeded. Iris did have faith in systems, in patterns, in the idea that evidence never really disappeared. It just sat there waiting for someone with enough self-control to connect the dots. She'd spent 8 years with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation before she was recruited by the Columbus Police Department in 2015. There, she learned how quickly and easily cases become cold, how memory is lost, how evidence degrades, how stories become rumor. The name Rebecca Thompson was one she half remembered, the sort known to younger detectives about their town legends, rumor case files that lingered in the corridors. But Iris had never opened that folder herself. Until the new technology in the department made her. It had been called CaseLink, an innovative database operated by pattern detection software built originally to find financial chicanery. Now it was charged with uncovering concealed relationships within decades of unsolved cases. Iris was charged with operating it that summer of 2018 to enter data, observe outcomes, and figure out whether the digital era could do what human memory could not anymore. Then, on a night in August, the machine flashed a fresh warning: 3 missing persons cases. 3 women, 3 years apart, all from the Columbus area. And the system claimed there was an 87% probability that they were connected. Hooked by numbers alone, Iris dove in. The first file belonged to Jennifer Moore, a 38-year-old Phoenix City, Alabama, schoolteacher. She had disappeared in June of 2003 by departing a small neighborhood barbecue on her bicycle. Her friends had thought she'd made it home safely, until her bike was discovered 3 days later, padlocked to a tree alongside a boat ramp on the Chattahoochee River. She'd never been found. The second was Rebecca Thompson, April 2005, bike again. Bull Creek, same stillness, same hollowness. The third was Patricia Hammond, 45-year-old Katola bookkeeper. Gone in September 2007 for an evening church service. Her car was found 2 days later in a gravel parking lot close to Callaway Gardens, close to water, like the others. 3 women, 3 years, 3 cases, each ending with the same unsettling quiet, but never connected to one another, until today. The clock crept past midnight, and Iris sat at her desk, a lukewarm cup of coffee beside her. She read every sentence, every account, every witness statement. The harder she looked, the more impossible it was to ignore the resonances between them. The females were all white, ranging in age from 38 to 45. All were from or near Columbus. All disappeared after evening outings. All had a vehicle or bicycle recovered near water, as if the river itself was swallowing their secrets. But CaseLink had detected something much more insidious, something no human eye ever had. In each case, hidden deep in supplementals and interview logs, there was a name. Not a suspect, not a person of interest. Just a man who continued to pop up quietly, behind the scenes, as if hovering around the edge of every story. Brian Hoffman. He wasn't associated with any of the women, not at least. In Jennifer Moore's instance, he'd attended the barbecue, a guest of the host brother who'd departed early, mannered, helpful, nothing suspicious. In Rebecca Thompson's disappearance, he'd surfaced as a member of the search groups, one of those nice strangers who just wanted to do something. And in Patricia Hammond's instance, his pickup had been spotted around the park, where her car was later found. He told police he'd been fishing. They believed him. 3 times, 3 appearances, 3 years apart, and every time, someone vanished. Detective Campbell felt that quiet, familiar chill that every investigator learns to trust, that whisper in the back of the mind that says, "You've seen him before." She pulled out his DMV picture. Hoffman was 49 at the time. Thinning brown hair, ordinary face. The kind of man nobody would remember, even after talking to him. Forgetting. And that was the deadliest kind of person walking the streets. She started digging. Hoffman had lived in Columbus since 1997, relocating there after a divorce from his wife, Cheryl. He was an HVAC technician, steady work, no social life so to speak. His boss described him as quiet and punctual. Neighbors said he kept to himself, no trouble, no noise. Just another ordinary man in a quiet southern town. But once Iris subpoenaed his phone records, the pattern accelerated. Each time a woman went missing, 2003, 2005, 2007, his cell phone rang off towers closest to where they worked or resided. The location wasn't precise, technology was not yet able to provide positions, but it was enough to signal proximity. Enough to raise hairs on the back of her neck. Coincidence? Maybe, but Iris Campbell had seen too many coincidences turn into confessions. So she dug deeper. This time deeper. Who was Brian Hoffman really? And why did his quiet shadow blanket the lives of 3 women? Women who vanished without leave by the same waters that ran through his town. The system had shown her a trend. Now, it was up to her to locate the man behind it. Detective Iris Campbell had seen enough coincidences in her years on the job to know that random rarely meant harmless. The cell tower data wasn't precise. Mid-2000s technology never was, but the general pattern leapt out like a beat beneath the white noise. Brian Hoffman's cell had been in Phoenix City several times last month, when Jennifer Moore disappeared. It had reported near the community center, where Rebecca Thompson worked. And it had pinged off towers off of Old Whitesville Road, near Patricia Hammond's house. The signal was there, though, but weak, the shadow of a whisper through static. Campbell submitted her report to her lieutenant, Douglas Walsh, a 30-year veteran, whose conservatism had spared the department more than one public humiliation. Walsh sat silently, leaning back in his chair and drumming a pencil on the folder. When he did speak, it was in the guarded calmness of a man who'd learned to fear patterns to neat. "It's interesting," he said. "But interesting isn't evidence," he warned her. Correlation did not equal causation. A couple of points of data weren't evidence. But he gave her the green light for minimal surveillance. 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Just enough to monitor Hoffman's routines, not enough to drive him away, and so Campbell waited. From the early morning darkness to the evening dusk, she and her escort watched over Hoffman's plain tiny house. The same routine went down like a practice drill, to 6:45 leaving for work, back at around 5:30, grocery shopping on Thursday evenings, gas station on Sunday afternoons. The man's life was excruciatingly routine, Saturdays being the only exception. Every so often, Hoffman would load a small aluminum boat into the bed of his truck and drive down to the Chattahoochee River, near Oxbow Meadows. There he'd sit 4 hours by himself, fishing, or at least make-believe fishing. Campbell watched in binoculars as the boat rode the current, a flat silhouette against the brown water. She had no idea why, but something about this boat irritated her. Maybe it was the way normal it looked, the kind of boat 1,000 individuals owned, but yet somehow this one had a quiet menace. She traced the registration. Hoffman had bought it in February 2004 used, cash, from a man in Phoenix City. More than a year before Rebecca Thompson vanished. And only a few months before Jennifer Moore. Then Campbell started digging into Hoffman's work history. Thousands of service calls, going back to 2001, or names, addresses, receipts, a mountain of data. But as she started cross-checking those records against the missing persons, the similarities accumulated. He'd serviced an air conditioner at Jennifer Moore's school 2 months before she vanished. He'd done a service call 3 doors down from Patricia Hammond's house weeks before she vanished. And he'd worked at the community center, where Rebecca Thompson volunteered, just a month before she went missing. Coincidence upon coincidence, until it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It meant nothing to anyone else, the kind of thing that would be dismantled in minutes by a defense attorney. Campbell had built cases on thinner threads before. Actual investigations weren't solved by smoking guns. They were solved by persistence, by listening when individual pieces began humming along at the same pitch. She asked to have Hoffman brought in for a voluntary interview. Walsh refused. Too early, he explained, too risky. One wrong move and the man would be in hiding before they had anything solid. Instead, he authorized a more extensive background check, finances, contacts, anyone who might reveal what kind of man Brian Hoffman was. Campbell agreed, but rage brewed beneath the surface. Each day they procrastinated. He was a free man. Each week, she saw that boat disappear from the river, and all the women, Jennifer, Rebecca, Patricia, and the way each of them had vanished by water came to mind. And then, time eventually caught up with them. In the beginning of 2020, construction of the new Victory Drive Bridge, years in the planning, had finally started. The old bridge, built in 1968, was structurally unsafe, and so construction crews were digging riverbanks for new support columns. Morning of March 12th, experienced operator Thomas Clark was excavating the east bank when his machinery struck something that wasn't ringing like rock. It gave, soft, hollow, wrong. Clark walked down to take a peek. Half buried in the red Georgia clay was what he initially thought was old PVC pipe, until he knelt closer. In an instant, recognition started churning his stomach. It was not pipe. It was bone. He stumbled back, gasping, instinct screaming. Within an hour, the perimeter was cordoned with yellow tape. By mid-morning, Detective Iris Campbell was standing on the edge of the trench, mud dripping through the holes in her boots, staring out at fragments of a long-dead body. 15 years buried had reduced the bones to less than skeleton material. Ribs scattered here and there, vertebrae misplaced, fabric adhering to bone in black, rotting tatters. The reddish soil had drained all color from the scene and left it a deep, rusty brown. No jewelry, No wallet, no ID, only the obdurate patience of time. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the county's veteran medical examiner, arrived before noon. Calm, clinical, unflinching, together, she and Campbell worked the scene, documenting every fragment, every inch of disturbed earth. It's female, Dr. Mitchell said softly, studying the pelvis, but we'll need lab work to be sure. No bullet holes, no cut marks, no fractures. The skeleton had no outward signs of violence, only emptiness. Mitchell reminded her, drowning does not leave scars. Strangulation does not leave any mark on bone. They sifted soil through screens for 6 interminable hours, buttons, cloth, the fragment of a shoe sole, nothing else. When the last tatters were packed and labeled, the river bank was still again, as if it had surrendered a secret it had held for so long. 11 days elapsed until the call. The identification through DNA was positive, Rebecca Thompson. Missing since April 14, 2005. Discovered within less than 3 miles of where her bicycle was discovered. 15 years gone, and now, finally, she'd come home. Campbell herself had made the call. On the second ring, Margaret Wilson picked up. All these years later, she didn't need words to understand. Silence was more than sufficient. The discovery flipped everything on its head. What had been a pattern study on cold cases was now a murder investigation. And the river that had kept Rebecca Thompson hidden for 15 years was about to uncover more than a single secret. The discovery of Rebecca Thompson's body did not just reopen a cold case, it blew it up. What had been a muted exploration of trends and possibilities now became an open homicide. And with that shift came something new: evidence, real, physical, undeniable evidence. When the forensic unit of Dr. Sarah Mitchell examined the remains, they found something strange: thin strands of dark blue synthetic fiber adhering to the clay. They looked plain at first glance, but with the microscope, they were telling. The fabric was too tight, too coarse to be clothing or carpet in a residence. The state crime lab confirmed it. This was not material from a dress or rug. It was car carpeting, of any specific make, to boot. The fibers matched the material used in Ford F-150 pickup trucks, made between 1998 and 2006, information that sealed the net around the name of one man, Brian Hoffman. Detective Iris Campbell did not delay. On March 28, 2020, she obtained a warrant to search Hoffman's property. The world was beginning to shut down from the first waves of COVID-19. But this would not wait. The warrant included the limited search, his vehicles, and a small outbuilding at the rear of his small rental home. When the squad arrived, Hoffman was on duty. Behind the lone garage, where it sat in near surgical neatness, was a tan 2003 Ford F-150, or 17 years old and spotless. It seemed the sort of truck that belonged to a man who prided himself on control. Campbell had it driven to the police impound, where forensic technicians combed every square inch. What they found wasn't a cry of guilt, but a whisper. Behind a heavy rubber mat in the bed, pieces of the truck's original carpet were still stuck to the metal, the color, the feel, the weave of the fibers. They had matched the ones which were found at Rebecca Thompson's grave site nearly perfectly. Alone, it wasn't sufficient to convict. Too many trucks, too many variables. But when combined with the cell tower data, the work records, the boat, and his appearance at 3 overlapping vanishing points, it was no longer coincidental. It was convergence. Campbell and Lieutenant Walsh decided it was time. They called Hoffman on April 2, 2020, for follow-up questions about his volunteer work during the 2005 searches. He appeared voluntarily, wearing still his Navy HVAC uniform, cool, nearly unflustered. At first, the interview had been amiable. He had spoken of the search parties, of wanting to help, of not knowing Rebecca, but feeling sorry for her family. His answers were rehearsed, consistent, mechanical almost. But as Campbell let the conversation shift gently to his truck, his roots, Bull Creek, something ignited. He leaned away, his hands slid out of sight beneath the table, his tone flattened. When she told him she made the fiber identification, he went silent. The tension grew thick, and then he asked the question every detective wishes for: should I have an attorney? The interview was over in an instant. It had to be, legally. Hoffman was terminated, ordered not to leave the county. Campbell could feel it. They were at the edge of something enormous. But edges are fragile. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. 3 days went by, and her phone rang. It was Robert Burns, a new public defender assigned to Hoffman. His voice was blunt. "My client wants to talk." On April 7, 2020, Brian Hoffman sat again in that same interview room, his lawyer by his side. And this time, he admitted, his words were deliberate, measured, chilling in their plainness. He said he'd trailed Rebecca Thompson from the community center that evening in April of 2005, pushed her off her bike. There'd been a struggle. He'd overpowered her. He said it wasn't planned, that he just acted. He described to unwrap her body in plastic from his toolbox, place her in his truck, drive to the riverbank, and bury her where the new bridge would one day stand. He cried as he testified, but Campbell sensed it, the hollow gesture of a man faking regret. When she pressed him on the other missing women, Jennifer Moore and Patricia Hammond, he shut down. His attorney intervened. No more questions. Hoffman denied all of it except Rebecca. But the details he did give didn't quite add up. Something in his story, about digging a 4-foot hole in Georgia clay, alone, in the dark, within hearing distance of Victory Drive, wasn't possible. Campbell knew that kind of digging. It wasn't silent. It wasn't quick. It wasn't secretive. So she returned to the riverbank, night after night, where he'd told her he'd hidden Rebecca. Standing there, listening, estimating distance, imagining the circle of shovels through mud. It didn't add up. If Hoffman was not alone, who helped him? That drove the investigation into dark waters. Campbell spent days digging into Hoffman's old phone records, and one name kept popping up: Dale Hoffman, his cousin in Phoenix City, just across the state line, a mechanic, divorced. To drunk driving convictions, shades a quiet life over a pawn shop, a Highway 280. Campbell and an out-of-town detective staked out Dale's apartment on April 15, 2020. As Dale came home from work, his coveralls greasy and sweaty. He acted dumb at first, didn't know Brian, they weren't friends, couldn't remember when they'd last seen each other. But phone records indicated otherwise. 7 calls between the two of them the 14 days leading up to Rebecca's disappearance. One of them, 40 minutes, at 11:30 the night she vanished. Grilled, Dale's facade broke. The facade slipped. He admitted Brian had called him that night, told him he needed help with something. Dale claimed he'd gone out to Columbus and met Brian at Bull Creek, and there was where the second shock was waiting. Dale Hoffman's testimony began like a man trying to dig his way out of his own conscience. He told investigators that Brian had called him late one night, hysterical, saying there'd been an accident. He needed help, something heavy, something he couldn't carry on his own. When Dale arrived, too late, a wonderful sheaf of plastic wrapping lay in the headlights. He asked no questions, could not. By the time he realized what he was helping with, his hands were already at the end of the load. He was in it now. Dale described taking rides with Brian behind the wheel in his own car down dark side roads, to a place along the river, isolated from the rest. Dale stood next to Brian holding a flashlight as Brian dug, the beam cutting through the blackness as metal clunked against clay. Once Brian's hands became blistered, Dale picked up the shovel and assisted with digging, too. It was nearly 3 hours. When the grave was covered with leaves, the early light of dawn was creeping among the trees. He swore he never inquired of her who the woman was, never gave a damn. He described as he drove back to Alabama before the sun had a chance to rise and tried to scrub the night out of his mind. But the truth has a way of sticking, no matter how deeply you bury it. Detective Campbell leaned him up against the other missing women, Jennifer Moore, Patricia Hammond, and Dale had denied it all. His words were pure, scripted, too guarded. It wasn't ignorance she was hearing. It was terror. But until there were bodies, until there were witnesses, until there was something real, her hands were tied. Dale Hoffman was arrested and charged with tampering with evidence and hiding a death. The sentence could be up to 5 years. But they all knew they'd likely end up in a plea bargain. His silence cost him less by the day. Campbell went further afield. She wanted to know what kind of individual Brian Hoffman really was, and who had seen that shadow up close. His former wife, Cheryl, spoke up first. She hadn't seen or heard from Brian in almost 10 years, living quietly still in Macon. She talked about a marriage that gradually soured into domination. A man who monitored her whereabouts, tracked her friends, made her feel followed even in the house she shared with him. She said Brian was fanatical about his truck. No one, not him or her, not even their son or daughter, was allowed in after 2004. He told them was for work only, though his company already provided a van. She remembered him installing new carpet in the bed of the truck during that time period, attributing it to damage from battery acid. She never trusted him. Then there was Ellen Porter, a woman who dated Brian briefly in 2006. Her memories painted an even darker picture. At first, he'd been nice, polite, the kind of guy who opened doors and remembered birthdays. But within weeks, the charm became stalking. He'd show up unexpectedly, drive around her office, park his truck outside her church on Sunday mornings, despite the fact that she'd never told him where she went to church. Ellen ended it with him, after he was discovered in her flat one night, using a key that she was unaware he had made. He explained that he had been checking she was safe. It's the kind of explanation that feels overprotective, until you realize that it's predatory. But one story from Ellen stopped Campbell cold. During one of their dates, Brian had driven her past Bull Creek, the same stretch of road where Rebecca Thompson's bicycle was found. He'd slowed the truck, pointed to the trees, and said, "You'd be amazed how easy it is for people to disappear. Water and time. They erase everything." When it occurred, Ellen had brushed it aside as morbid laughter. Now, it was a confession masquerading in light conversation. The break came when Campbell obtained a full search warrant for Brian's property at Old River Road. The team dug deeper this time. In the rafters of the small backyard shed, the police found a plastic trash bag long since destroyed by moisture and time. Inside it was a mold-covered canvas tote. Inside the tote was a wallet. Inside the wallet, a Georgia driver's license. The inscription on it, Patricia Hammond, and there was $17 in wrinkled bills and 2 expired credit cards. Campbell didn't need a jury to make this clear to her. It was a trophy. Proof that Patricia had crossed Rebecca into the same destiny, even though her body was never discovered. 3 years lapsed before the case proceeded to trial. February 8, 2023, Muskogee County Superior Court. A courtroom that had seen generations of tears and verdicts was preparing itself for one of its most sinister cases. After years of delays in the courts and pandemic lockdowns, the state of Georgia versus Brian Hoffman was finally underway. The courtroom itself was heavy with history, polished wooden benches worn to a shine, humming fluorescent lights overhead, anticipation heavy in the air. Judge Patricia Coleman sat on the bench, a no-nonsense judge known for her attention to detail and disdain for courtroom theatrics. Brian Hoffman was indicted on malice murder and concealment of death and tampering with evidence. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Marcus Thompson, built the case piece by piece, from the early vanishings, through the fiber evidence, to the confession by Hoffman. Detective Campbell testified over 2 days, guiding the jury through the investigation, how the patterns fit together, how the evidence mounted on top of evidence until the truth could no longer hide. And then Dale Hoffman, his own testimony contradictory and convincing, a man ambushed by his own loyalty and shame. He recalled the evening of April 14, 2005, his light cutting through the darkness, the ringing of shovels against clay. He said he'd assumed it was an accident, but the details, their specificity, their tone, carried the weight of something so much more calculated. The defense tried to turn Dale into a fantasist, a liar telling tales to save his own neck, but his version was too conveniently supported by the facts to be dismissed outright. But there are boundaries to the law. Without bodies, without evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, prosecutors were unable to tie Hoffman to the killings of Jennifer Moore or Patricia Hammond. Jennifer's body was never found. Patricia's wallet provided link, but not cause. That unseen anger filled the courtroom, the unseen knowledge that Brian Hoffman was likely guilty of more than the law could touch. And yet, even as the justice grew stronger, the persistent questions still lingered underneath it all. The courtroom felt tighter by the final day of trial, the kind of tightness that occurs when months of tension are compressed into one instant. For Margaret Wilson, every single second of it mattered. She sat at the rear of the prosecution bench, second row, in one of the same 3 outfits. She rotated each week. There wasn't sufficient time or money to head home, but that didn't matter. What did was showing up to see, to witness, to make sure her daughter's story didn't go unnoticed. Margaret was 58, but she looked older. Grey threaded the hair, she no longer bothered to dye, and her hands were perpetually pink from hospital scrub sinks of 2 decades. She watched Brian Hoffman every day from her chair, not with indignation, but with an intense, unreadable expression, between grief and morbid pleasure. At last, after 18 years, she received her answer, just not the kind that assists. Dennis Thompson never appeared. He'd left Georgia years earlier, moved to South Carolina after he'd retired from the furniture plant. He'd remarried, met a woman in a grief support group, and had told detectives he couldn't sit through hearing about Rebecca's death. Margaret recognized that kind of escape, though she couldn't give herself the same courtesy. Some stay alive by confronting the darkness, others stay alive by never looking at all. The defense, hoping against hope, depended on every technicality at their command. They charged Hoffman with coerced confession, the result of prolonged interrogation and mental pressure. They described the fiber evidence as circumstantial, a coincidence of omnipresent materials. Their experts testified to false confessions, unflawed forensics, to how easily patterns become meaningful when investigators are desperate for closure. They framed Hoffman as a loner caught in the machinery of an overburdened police department, a fall guy for a case that the city desired swept under the rug as much as its victims. But the jury wasn't fooled. After 2 grueling days and 11 hours of deliberation, they returned to the courtroom, still, slow, serious. The foreman stood up, and the words all of them had been waiting 18 years to hear suddenly echoed off the paneling. Guilty on all counts. Judge Patricia Coleman sentenced Brian Hoffman to life, without the possibility of parole, and additional consecutive terms to ensure he never walked free again. Hoffman blinked not. He stood between his attorneys, expression numb, as if it weren't his own life being ripped apart, but another's. It was the same unearthly remoteness he'd exhibited since day one, the mask of a man for whom compassion had been long dead. Dale Hoffman spent close to 2 years, before he was paroled in early 2024, a free man with the kind of remorse that parole officers can't quantify. Ellen Porter, whose quiet courage as a witness had assisted in piecing together a more thorough picture of who Brian truly was, moved to Tennessee shortly after. She rejected all subsequent interview requests, opting instead to keep silent rather than reliving the horror. When the case did finally close, the Columbus Police Department returned Rebecca's bike to its owners, The very same bike that had once been found half buried in mud at Ball Creek. Dennis donated it to a local charity that refurbishes bikes for children. Margaret did not grumble. Some things were just better left behind. But two names still hung in the air like cold cases: Jennifer Moore and Patricia Hammond. Their cases are open, labelled cold, but not closed, still pending the kind of evidence that may never come. No bodies, no confessions, no conclusions. The Chattahoochee River continues to run past Columbus, its surface calm, its depths heavy with secrets. On quiet Sunday mornings, fishermen launch out their small aluminum boats and cast lines into the same waters that once hid ugly truths, never knowing, or maybe never bothering. And Margaret Wilson, she still keeps the wall in her guest room, the one covered with maps, photographs, and newspaper articles. But now there are verdicts pinned on alongside the missing person flyers: justice, piecemeal. She's no longer a nurse, but now works with victims' advocacy organizations, speaking with detectives and families about what it means to never, ever let go. Every time she drives across the Victory Drive Bridge, she gazes out at the river, the same river where her daughter was stolen, and ultimately, where she was brought back. The new bridge opened in 2021, broad and streamlined, built to handle thousands of cars a day. But beneath its streamlined concrete surface, the old currents still flow, slow, secret, and silent. Because some stories don't end when the sentence is read. Others nestle only in the bed of the river, resting, waiting, beneath the red Georgia clay.